Hello and welcome. I am Pravir Malik, and today I am essentially going to share some thoughts on light, and more importantly, also draw the connection between light and some technologies such as quantum computation and the field of genetics, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism. So to get into the nature of light, I'm going to pose a couple of thought experiments. But first, let me start with a fact. We know that light in the physical universe travels at 186,000 miles per second. The question is, why is that the case? So in this talk, I hope to answer that. But more importantly, get to a multi-dimensional model of light in which the way we experience light physically at 186,000 miles per second will be seen as an edge only of what light is. So to begin, let's conduct a thought experiment in which we imagine that light is traveling infinitely fast. So let's consider a volume. It can be however large we want it to. It can be the size of a galaxy or the universe or of our solar system. But in our mind's eye, let's just imagine this vast volume. And at the center, we have a source of light, and that light travels infinitely fast. So what may we be able to say about the nature of the reality that's created if light were to travel infinitely fast? First, it would fill up the entire volume instantaneously. So light would be present everywhere. It would be all present, or it would be omnipresent. So there's a property that light has, which we may call omnipresence. Now, since everything is filled with this fabric of light, then anything that appears or disappears in this volume is going to be recorded in the fabric of light. And therefore, light is going to have a knowledge of that space that exists within this volume. So it's going to have an all knowledge, or let's just call that an omniscience. Thirdly, if anything not of the nature of light were to arise, then it would sooner or later be subsumed by light itself. And therefore, light has an implicit property of power, or we may call it omnipotence. Finally, since everything is connected in the nature of light, in this space where it's traveling infinitely fast, then there is an implicit harmony that exists by nature of being in the substance of light. And so we may call this omniharmony or omninurturance. And so there's four properties that we may say arise due to this light in this volume, however large it might be. And to summarize, there are omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omniharmony. And we may just call this, for convenience sake, presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So there's these four qualities, or these four properties that we're saying are implicit in light. Now let me shift gears and come back to this scenario where light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So let's imagine the sun rising on the horizon, and we know that light from the sun will take 8.5 minutes to reach the earth. And imagine that you are on a ray of light and you're halfway between that journey. As you look back, you'll realize that roughly 4.5 minutes in the past, you were at the sun. 4.5 minutes in the future, approximately, you'll be at the earth. And in the present moment, you're halfway in between. And therefore, the very nature of what time is, past, present, and future, it can be argued, arise because of the way light is traveling. And also, because light is traveling at a finite speed, whatever information or energy it's trying to relay is going to require a certain amount of distance to be traveled in order to express itself. And we may say that that finite distance in which whatever is being expressed can express itself is related to what we may call Planck's constant, or the smallest measurable quantity, whether in time or in space, that we have actually been able to measure. And so we also know that this Planck's constant, or this finite packet or quanta that emerges that's related to Planck's constant, is the basis of all matter. Matter requires this finiteness expressing itself in quanta in order to build itself. And therefore, we may say that because of the way light is traveling in this physical universe, these four fundamental experiences implicit with it of past, present, future, and matter arise because of the way light is traveling. But let me also now draw the connection between the first thought experiment, where we came up with presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, and the second thought experiment, where we surfaced these properties or the experiences of past, present, future, and matter. Now, if we think about the past, imagine now, or just look around wherever you are, in a room, or on your desk, or in a chair. And through contemplation, you'll see that whatever exists around you is due to the past. There's activity that's occurred in the past. And in that activity, we may say that there's a presence. And this has created everything that we experience around us that has the physicality to it. So the past, in this point of view, is related to this thing that we derived when light's traveling infinitely fast, called presence. Now, similarly, if you think about this present moment and what may be going on inside you, there may be many different thoughts, many different emotions, perceptions, assumptions. And it's the strongest one that's going to express itself and determine how you're experiencing this moment. And therefore, the present can be connected to this thing that we call power. And when we think about the future, there's some seed ideas that will inevitably express themselves in whatever future we consider. There's something that's going to express itself. And so there's a causality. And so this causality is giving us a glimpse into this thing that we called knowledge when light was traveling infinitely fast. And similarly, when we think about matter and the way matter arises, we will see that matter always has a relationship with other pieces of matter. So there may be islands that emerge, and these islands are in coordination or in harmony with other surfacings of matter. And therefore, we may say that matter is implicitly expressing some kind of harmony that existed when light was traveling infinitely fast. And so we can say that this past, present, future, and matter that arise when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second are the same thing, a different face of what we saw as being presence, power, knowledge, and harmony when light's traveling infinitely fast. In other words, there is what we call in mathematics a symmetry that expresses itself. So when light's traveling infinitely fast, there's four properties that we call presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second, it's these same four properties which call presence, power, knowledge, harmony that express themselves as past, present, future, and matter. Now, let's go deeper into this model of light. And again, the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to suggest that light has a fundamental place in our experience, is fundamental to the notion of quanta. And I'm going to draw the bridge in a little while as to how this notion of light and this notion of quanta needs to be thought of when we think about quantum computation, the new technology that is emerging today, and other technologies. And so, stepping back in this talk, we're looking scientifically, we're trying to go deeper into some assumptions, and we're trying to surface a different view of technology, with quantum computation being central to what may emerge in the future. So let me go back to this light model. So we hypothesized a layer of light traveling infinitely fast that has the properties presence, power, knowledge, harmony. We hypothesized light traveling at 186,000 miles per second that creates our experience of past, present, future, and matter. And we said that because light's traveling at a finite speed, it creates this lower bound of existence that we scientifically know as quanta or Planck's constant. Now, this idea of light traveling at different speeds, and this idea of it creating the lowest bound of existence in whatever layer it exists, scientifically sets up two constants, C and H. H is Planck's constant, that are instrumental in defining the bounds of our physical universe. And we understand that when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second. But I want to suggest that even when light's traveling infinitely fast, we may think of the C as being infinite. So obviously, the speed of light is infinite. And since there's an inverse proportionality between the speed of light and this thing that we call Planck's constant that appears when light's traveling 186,000 miles per second, we may say that the similar experience of this Planck's constant would be as a quantity zero when light's traveling infinitely fast. And because it's a quantity zero, then therefore, that expression of what emerges or what can emerge from light when it's traveling infinitely fast is completely unified. That's why it is all one when light's traveling infinitely fast. But now let's hypothesize that there are other constant speeds that light may travel at. And so let's assume a constant speed where light is traveling below infinite speed, but much, much, much faster than C, 186,000 miles per second. Because that's happening, so light's traveling very fast compared to 186,000 miles per second. So if we look at the inverse proportionality of that, we may say that the corresponding H of Planck's constant will be a much smaller quantity. And therefore, this thing that we call matter won't be able to bind itself in the manner that it does when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second. And so what will express itself as an equivalent of matter will look like, rather than particles that appear when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second, will express itself perhaps as a large field. but yet there's a differentiation that's occurring. So when we consider these properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, we may say that due to this quantization that occurs when light drops its speed, and the quantization is occurring because there is a finite h, a finite Planck's constant that is non-zero, but yet is much lower than h as we know here at the physical universe. We may say that due to this act of quantization, this thing that we call presence, power, knowledge, harmony diversifies into sets of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if we think about this property presence, for instance, then what we're saying is that whatever is implicit in presence, whatever is implied by presence, differentiates into a very large, practically infinite set of many elements that all distinctly show you how presence can be divided or differentiated. So there are many things that are related to presence that show up in that set. Similarly, when we think about knowledge, there's a practically infinite set that emerges at this first level of quantization that also expresses what is implicit in knowledge. And similarly for harmony, and similarly for power. So we may say that at this first quantization that is due to light traveling at a slower speed than infinity, but much faster than c, whatever is implicit in light makes itself a little more explicit. And in that explicitness, we can differentiate the infinity of information that was one, now, quote unquote, materializing as a field in this layer where light is traveling very, very, very fast. Similarly, if we think about a next quantization, so light dropping its speed even further, but yet much higher than c, then we can also hypothesize, or we can see that the inverse of that, which creates the lower bound of existence, or the equivalent of h, is again going to be some quantity that's very small, but still much smaller than what appears in when light's traveling at c, but much larger than zero, or even in the first layer where the first quantization occurs. And so there's going to be another act of quantization, meaning that there's going to be a further differentiation. So right now we have 4 large sets that express knowledge, power, presence, harmony as infinite number of elements. And with this other quantization, we may say that infinite number of unique elements are going to arise. So how maybe we think of these unique elements, or let me call them seeds. So there's potentially these subtle seeds that now arise in this layer of light that exists because light's traveling much faster than c, but lower than the other 2 speeds we hypothesized. And so we may think of these unique seeds as being unique elements from each of the 4 sets. And so you can see that there's a precise mathematical relationship that would define the nature of every unique seed that would exist in that layer of this second quantization. Now, I want to propose that when light from that layer drops to the speed c, then all that infinite unique seeds that express themselves in this conceptual space become now, at this layer of c, the very fabric of what space is. So when we think about space, then space has implicit in it these infinite unique seeds that create the substance of what space is. But there's also some other qualities that arise at this moment where light goes through another act of quantization to become light traveling at speed c. There is then the emergence of what we may call time, because whatever is implicit in each of these unique seeds, these subtle seeds, will express their concept materially through the passage of time. And that is what time is. And so time in this notion is not absolute. It's relative, and depending on how things may express itself or express themselves for each unique seed. We may think also of that act of materialization. So as time, with the passage of time, these subtle seeds that make up the fabric of space materialize through some implicit energy that accompanies them. And this energy, or this process of transformation from something subtle to material, we may call energy. And finally, we may think of the fact that when we look around us materially, there is a harmony that exists. And this harmony is due to a relationship that exists between seed and seed, or between sets of seeds and sets of seeds. And this we may think of as gravity. So what I want to propose is that when light drops to the speed c, then there are some fundamental things that are happening. There's a creation of space, time, energy, and gravity as we understand it that comes into being when light begins to travel at 186,000 miles per second. But also this notion or this concept that we call the Big Bang, it comes into being when light drops to 186,000 miles per second. And so what we may say is that in this light-based model, there are simultaneous layers of light. The largest one, which wraps everything, is where light travels infinitely fast. Everything else is a projection from that. And then as light quantizes itself, it creates these multiple layers of realities that through the act of subsequent quantization becomes our experience of this physical universe with the macro parameters of space, time, energy, and gravity, all precipitating with that event that we call the Big Bang. So you may see that in this notion, quanta and quantization can be thought of as entirely different than how we think about it with our current scientific lens. So quantization is, in this notion, a persistent activity, because at every point, at every instant of time, there is this act of light materializing something of itself, and it's materializing itself through different layers of quantization. And so when you think about quantum computation, it becomes a persistent creative act by which this material universe is created. So that's implicitly what quantum computation is. There's a persistent act of computation, you may say, in which these subsequent layers of light are materializing the information that exists in them. But there's an act of arbitration. So whatever when the Big Bang started or was initiated, that set into motion this idea of space and set into motion a clock in which time began and set into motion the process of material energy and of gravity that connects seeds to seeds. But then once materialization continues, then there's an arbitration that always takes place between these implicit levels of quantization and what has already emerged to determine what will emerge as time plays itself out for each of these seeds. And this act of arbitration can be thought of as a cosmic level quantum computation that is persistently occurring to redefine our universe from moment to moment. Now, we've looked at a couple of instances of what emerges. I had initially begun this talk with the idea of presence, power, knowledge, harmony as being implicit to light, and we notice that when light travels infinitely fast. I had suggested subsequently that when light expresses itself at the speed of 186,000 miles per second, then our experience of past, present, future, and matter arises. And that too is a symmetrical face of the same presence, power, knowledge, harmony that shows up as past, present, future, and matter. But let's also think about what space-time, energy, gravity are. So when we think about space, as I said, it is due to these infinite subtle seeds that exist in the layer of light traveling faster than C that now need an arena to express themselves. That arena is space. So we may say that space is housing an archetype of the information or the knowledge that exists in layers of light traveling much faster than C. And therefore, space is, in this point of view, nothing other than an expression of light's property of knowledge. When we think about time, then the inevitability of what's contained within these subtle seeds expressing themselves materially means that time is expressing light's property of power. When we think about energy, and energy being fundamental to transformation into material form, then we can see that energy is nothing other than light's property of presence. And when we think about gravity, which defines relationship between seed and seed or seeds and seeds, we can see that this is nothing other than light's property of harmony. Therefore, space, time, energy, gravity are themselves an expression of what's implicit in light. So knowledge, presence, power, harmony, expressing themselves as these macro parameters or space-time, energy, gravity that define, in a sense, the cosmos in its upper bound within which we exist. So we have seen now that there is a few different manifestations of light expressing itself, space-time, energy, gravity, past, present, future, matter. But let's continue with this and draw back to this idea of quantum computation, because the act, one can say, of the creation of space-time, energy, gravity, of past, present, future matter is nothing other than an output of this persistent quantum computation that is occurring all the time. When we think of matter that now arises within this space-time energy gravity, then we know that a first manifestation of this is quantum particles. And quantum particles are known to exist in 4 categories. No matter what kind of quantum particle, we can say that it's either a quark, a boson, a Higgs boson, or a lepton. But let's penetrate into what these really are. So a quark, we know, exists in the protons and neutrons that make up the nucleus. And we know that the number of protons defines uniquely the type of atom that shall be, or the behavior of that atom. So for example, if you have an atom with atomic number 47, you know that that is silver, and there's a precise behavior which will have with all other elements and how it will express itself. And this is determined by its number of protons, which in turn are entirely made up only of quarks. So we may say that in this point of view, quarks is a vehicle or a carrier of light's property of knowledge. Similarly, when we think about leptons, then if we consider a surrogate lepton as the electron, then we know that the expression or the movement of electrons usually is accompanied by the release of the accumulation of energy. And therefore, we may say that leptons is a carrier of light's property of energy or power. When we think about bosons, we know that these quantum particles essentially allow all other quantum particles to interact, and therefore bosons can be thought of as a carrier of harmony or light's property of harmony, an expression of light's property of harmony. And similarly, when we think about the Higgs boson, we know that any quantum particle that expresses itself materially or has mass has to interact with the Higgs field. And therefore, through the intermediary of the Higgs boson, and therefore Higgs boson becomes a carrier of this thing that we call presence, or light's property of presence. So we see that all quantum particles can be thought of as nothing other than a materialization of light's property of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So it's a computation into existence of something that's implicit in light. Now, before we move on to the subsequent emergences of matter, I want to also suggest that these implicit properties of light, presence, power, knowledge, harmony, also create what we experience or what we know as the electromagnetic spectrum. So that's the other fundamental phenomena or mechanism that exists in this universe, is the electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic spectrum. And these are, of course, when we think of scientifically of light, not only do we know it travels at 186,000 miles per second, but we also know that the electromagnetic spectrum is identified with what we call light. So I want to suggest that the electromagnetic spectrum is a first materialization of this thing we call light within this macro cosmos defined by space-time energy gravity, and before the emergence of quantum particles, which we already saw are related to the 4 properties of light. you can think of the electro aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum as being related to this thing that we call power within light. You can think of the magnetic aspect as being related to harmony. But then we also know that there are an infinite number of frequencies that make up the spectrum. And therefore, there's an archetype of many different wavelengths that can exist in the electromagnetic spectrum. And those archetypes express this thing that we call knowledge that exists within light. And finally, the variation in frequency or wavelength creates different possibilities for the way that matter may emerge. And therefore, we can say that implicit in this thing we call the electromagnetic spectrum are actually 4 properties of light that express themselves as this thing called the electromagnetic spectrum. And if we want to be more precise in what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, I would call it the electromagnetic wave archetype mass potential spectrum. But this is suggesting also that this is the manifestation or a computation into existence due to multiple layers or acts of quantization of light's implicit properties, the infinity that exists within presence, power, knowledge, harmony, expressing itself finitely. Now we see as space-time, energy, gravity is as what we call the electromagnetic spectrum and as quantum particles. And these 3 manifestations define the physics of our universe in a sense. So this thing that we call physics and the physicality of it is, in this point of view, nothing other than a manifestation, a persistent quantum computation of what exists inside light. Now, if we consider the next emergence of matter, then we know that these various quantum particles will interact to create what we call atoms. And these atoms, we know when we look at the periodic table, arrange themselves in one of 4 types. We call them the S type, P type, F type, and S, F, P, and G type. Sorry, the S, P, D, and F type. And these, I will also argue, are nothing other than a result of the persistent quantum computation, so that the property of light arranges itself as SPDF, which is nothing other than presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So why do I say that? So we think about S-shell atoms. A couple of representative atoms in the S-shell that are S-shell atoms are hydrogen and helium. But we know that hydrogen and helium, for instance, create this phenomenon of nuclear fusion and power the stars in our universe. So we may say that S-shell atoms are, in this point of view, a carrier of light's property of power. When we think about P-shell atoms, then we have atoms such as silicon and carbon, which silicon, of course, is from which all computing machinery arises. Carbon is responsible for life and for life that can hold mentality and thought in it. But we also see different archetypes within that P-shell range that, for example, consists of metals, metalloids, and so on, non-metals. So we see a vaster range that is expressing, in a sense, the variation in knowledge. So we may say that P-shell is a materialization of this thing that we may call knowledge. When you think of D shell atoms, then we know that many of the industrial atoms that are used to create infrastructure, whether carbon, nickel, aluminum, iron, cobalt, and so on, these are workhorse elements, and they allow this presence to be manifested. So we may say that the D shell is a carrier of light's property of presence. And similarly, when we look at F shell, then we may say that the F shell atoms are an experiment in collectivity. So we find the largest atoms with atomic number exceeding 100 in some cases exist in this F shell category. And so you can see that there's, in a sense, it's a materialization of light's property of harmony that's being expressed there. And the diversity of these atoms then creates all these molecules that we experience around us. And so molecules can also be thought of as expressions of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Molecules create molecular plans, and these molecular plans express themselves as living cells. And we know that in any living cell, whether it's plant, animal, or human, there are only 4 molecular plans. And we may call these nucleic acids, polysaccharides, lipids, and proteins. But I want to argue that, in fact, they also are nothing other than the materialization of light's properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So when we think about nucleic acids, we know, for instance, that they're integral in creation of DNA, and therefore they house all the knowledge that a cell has and how all the components of the cell will act. When a cell divides, then that DNA is distributed to the next generation. And so there's this implicit sense of nucleic acids being a carrier of light's property of knowledge. When we think about lipids, then lipids create natural compartments in cells. And so we can see that due to that, there's specialization of labor and the arisal of the notion of harmony. And therefore, we may say that lipid is a carrier of light's property of harmony. When we think about polysaccharides, these are sugars that power the cell. And so we may think of it as a carrier of light's property of power. And when we think about proteins, for instance, in a human cell, there are over 30,000 different proteins that all have very precise tasks that create a presence by which the cell can sustain itself. And so we can see that proteins are a materialization of light's property of presence. So through this act of quantum computation, the things that we fundamentally recognize as physics, chemistry, biology are all being created persistently. So we see this in the materialization, as I said, of space-time, energy, gravity, the electromagnetic spectrum, quantum particles that creates physics, in a sense, atoms of the periodic table that create all possibilities of chemistry, and then the molecular plans that create living cells and all possibilities of biology. So quantum computation can then be thought of something incredibly, immensely creative, fundamentally creative. And due to this implicit quantization that's occurring from layer of light to layer of light, the infinity of information that exists when light travels infinitely fast is finding ways to express itself. And then through arbitration, the next possibilities can emerge. In today's notion of quantum computation, we have heavily relied on what we call the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. And in this interpretation, a quantum object may exist in infinite number of states until measured, and when it's measured, it materializes. And so by definition, when one considers the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, any act of measurement would materialize whatever you're trying to measure, and therefore you would never be able to really see what's happening behind the quantum wave, because any kind of measurement will make it into a precise object with precise qualities. Copenhagen interpretation also suggests two properties of quantum objects, which we call superposition and entanglement. And superposition is this idea of a quantum object acting in infinite or being in infinite states until measured, and therefore it's superposed. And then you have entanglement, where you can have two quantum objects that are entangled. And due to that, one quantum object influences the properties of the other instantaneously, regardless of time and space difference. But now, when you consider this view of this multidimensional model of light, we may think of superposition and entanglement differently. And superposition can then be seen as this seed idea or unique seed that expresses itself at some layer above where light travels at C, but it has a deeper prototype, if you will, in the layers of light that are above it, and it expresses itself uniquely in the layer where light's traveling at C. So superposition then becomes a stack of this uniqueness that determines what's expressing itself in the layer of light where light's traveling at speed C. In this point of view, everything already is intimately entangled. Because everything is coming from a layer of light where oneness is the essence of the presence, power, knowledge, harmony that are implicit in light. So by definition, there's an entanglement that exists between everything that materializes. And this entanglement can have several different faces or different kinds of entanglement as we see the quantization occurring. So there's one kind of entanglement when light expresses itself at a speed below infinity, another kind of entanglement when light expresses itself at a speed above C. And so there's multiple kinds of entanglement that are possible, and these are simultaneous. And they determine, it's due to entanglement, one may say, that uniqueness exists at the material level. So the notion of entanglement, the notion of superposition, the notion of quantization can be different when we consider quantum computation from the point of view of a light-based model. And I want to propose that, in fact, this is a more precise way to think about quantum computation. And the reason I say that is because we see concrete manifestations of the fourfoldness of knowledge, presence, power, harmony that expresses itself tangibly as quantum particles, as the atoms of a periodic table, as molecular plans and cells that I already discussed. And all this must emanate from this quantum veil, which is the interface between the massive information that lies behind and the order that is expressing itself as matter and life emerge. So quantum computation can't be anything different. It has to be this link between the order that we see appearing, this fourfold order that we see appearing as matter and life arise, and the information that exists in light, that also I hypothesize is of a fourfold nature. So therefore, when we are creating quantum computers, the mistake that we don't want to make, which we are making right now, is to use the same paradigm that we're using for digital computers to conceptualize what's possible with quantum computers. The possibility inherent in quantum computation is inherently creative. There's something very different that can be done with quantum computation. Today, we are limiting ourselves by trying to solve or pose the same kinds of problems that we solve with digital computers. Now, this quantum computation, I want to suggest that exists persistently in each moment of this universe, has as its output genetic type information. So we already saw in this point of view, space-time energy gravity, the electromagnetic spectrum, quantum particles, atoms, cells. These emergences, they have a fourfold property to them that becomes a law at that level of manifestation. And it's the output of this quantum computation. So there's a genetic type information that creates the law for that level of how quantum particles will exist, how atoms will exist, how molecular plans and cells will exist. And so when we think about genetics, we have to think of it in terms of the output of this persistent quantum computation that can be influenced by what we create in the moment, because that's going to change what is arbitrated into existence. But again, there's a whole different way to think about genetics. And then by extrapolation, we can see that even in the smallest, simplest of things that occurs naturally, there's an incredible amount of intelligence, an incredible amount of order. There's this acts of quantum computation and acts of creation of genetic type information that accompanies the simplest of things. And when we think about artificial intelligence, we know that it's bound by the nature of how it's created, as opposed to the unbound nature of this intelligence. And so it suggests something different that we need to think about when we're thinking about artificial intelligence. And then when we utilize these three fundamental foundations or these technologies of quantum computation, genetics, and artificial intelligence, which we are beginning to do today, in the creation of transhumanism, we have to think again of, from a light point of view, what is quantum computation, what is genetics, what are the possibilities of artificial intelligence, and how can that influence something like transhumanism? And so the foundations for our future technology become fundamentally different when we actually consider this light-based model that I've spoken about today. I'll mention in closing here that this work on cosmology of light, and particularly the practical aspects of the foundation of quantum computation, genetics, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism, I've put together a lot of thoughts in 10 books, Cosmology of Light. The first 6 books already consider this basis of what I call cosmology of light, this persistent computation that creates a reality we are in. And then the last 4 books specifically take up the ideas of quantum computation from this point of view, genetics, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism. So for people who are interested in going further into this, that's why I mention it, is that you may refer to those books as a resource. Thank you.